This is the
Five Stars
podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Hi.
So, what do you guys want to talk about? Tell me when I'm telling lies.
Thanks, guys. Back to you.
It's almost kind of weird to look at only 5 pages of notes for Raw. In the last few shows I've recorded, I think I had somewhere in the ballpark of like 10 to 12. And a lot of that was mostly Mid-South coverage. So at least you know ahead of time this won't be a 2-hour podcast. And I think for all of our sanity, that'll be a good thing. But folks, you know what time it is. No, it's not Vader time. Although he was on the episode of Raw we're going to cover this week. It is Monday. So it is time for another installment of How Can I Keep You Entertained for 45 Minutes by talking about how terribly boring Raw was in 1996. Here on the Five Starr Wrestling Report, Mondays and Fridays, new shows, new discussions, same territories. We are the wrestling channel nobody knows but everybody needs. And we shout it from the rooftops each and every week. We're a small, proud wrestling channel. And if you're a returning viewer, then apparently I'm doing something right. Because I've kept your interest peaked. But whether you're new to the channel or you're somebody that just enjoys hearing me vent and rant about classic wrestling every week, make sure to subscribe, comment, give the show a like. Again, you can check us out on either YouTube or Rumble on Mondays and Fridays. I prefer trying to push Rumble as much as I possibly can, but I also understand the foothold that YouTube has in the world of video streaming platforms in terms of longevity and reliability. As much as I like Rumble and appreciate what they're trying to do, they've got their work cut out for them in more ways than one. I mean, one thing they really need to improve on, in addition to live streaming, is just general site maintenance. Because, God, their maintenance is terrible. But we will keep hoping for a real viable alternative. Boy, what does that sound like? That's the same thing I've been saying about pro wrestling for the past 24 years. Maybe someday there will be a viable alternative to WWE. And then along came TNA in the early 2000s, which was just a laughingstock for the better part of 10 to 12 years. Somehow they're still kicking after going on a decade of irrelevance. Then there's the whole AEW thing, which, well, I rest my case. Anywho, let's get into Retro Raw. What do we got? 2 weeks until WrestleMania 12? The more I watch of these Raws in the build-up, I continue to wonder, how in the hell did this WrestleMania get such positive reviews from all the critics? Well, I know why. It's because everybody at the time raved about how great the Brett-Shawn match was. But you remove that from the equation, this thing is on par with WrestleMania 11. Just in terms of being such a bland, nothing happening pay-per-view. We all remember how bad Mania 11 was. The first time going back and watching that fiasco from start to finish since it aired back in '94. And it'll certainly be the last time I ever go back and watch that piece of shit pay-per-view. One of the worst WrestleManias of all time. But like, seriously, take out the Ironman match for a sec. What is the other main draw for this Mania 12 card? The Piper Goldust Backlot Brawl? I mean, as an attraction match, it has some appeal on paper, I guess. Not really my flavor of style. I never really had much interest in Taker versus Diesel. Mainly because I never gave a crap about Diesel growing up. So to me, it was just kind of a wasted Taker match for WrestleMania. Say what you want about WrestleMania 41. I certainly have my own opinions about the way they've gone about piecing that show together. But at least you can objectively look at that card and be like, okay, there's an attraction match, there's an attraction match, there's another attraction match. I would certainly hope that to be the case, considering they're still running with these 2-night extravaganza marathons. And there better fucking be more than one attraction match for a 4+ hour PLE. But this was the reality of WWF in the mid to late 90s. They had lost so much star power in the last few years. I mean, just between Hogan and Savage alone. And while Vince was scraping the bottom of the barrel for talent, the WCW was either picking up or already had contracted all the big names. Hogan, Savage, Luger, Sting, Flair. Pretty soon they would have Hall and Nash. I mean, Vince was so desperate in '96, he had to try to recreate the magic of the Ultimate Warrior after the novelty had already worn off 5 years prior. Look where that got him. Guy didn't even last 6 months before he left. So it's no wonder you go back and look at this current Mania card, even when you take into account names like Piper and Warrior and Taker and Shawn and Brett, you really didn't have a lot of those WrestleMania attraction matches, those larger-than-life icon versus icon pairings. You just couldn't do that with the roster they had in '96. And I think that's why people overpraised the Ironman match at the time, because while, yes, it was a good match for its time, even though I think many would argue it doesn't really hold up when you see it 30+ years later, I think the reality is the rest of the card was so flat, the critics were willing to overlook a lot of that stuff in favor of what Brett and Shawn were able to do in the main event. And remember, too, not to play spoiler for when we review the show, the Ironman match was essentially the entire second half of the pay-per-view. This was still back before WrestleManias were fucking 7+ hour marathons. I think the longest match in the show outside the Ironman, it was the Backlot Brawl, right? And that was a special occasion because they had already pre-taped segments of that match to splice it up throughout the pay-per-view. So they kind of cheated it. But I don't think anything outside the main event exceeded the 20-minute mark. It's a good reality check for people to consider, though. When we talk so much about star power and draws in the business, but you still have to give the people a reason to care about those stars. I mean, you could hypothetically book an entire fantasy dream match card with the biggest draws and the biggest legends of all time. But let's be honest, nobody's going to pay to see those matches unless you give them a rhyme or a reason. And even when you look at those names I just rattled off, Piper, Warrior, Taker, Shawn, Brett, Jake Roberts, Austin, the list goes on. Yeah, those guys were huge names in the business, but it's what they were involved with on the card that made you think, that's not really a money match, or that's not really my cup of tea. Just the cynical, jaded wrestling fan in me talking again. Don't mind me. Anyway, y'all want to talk about the show? Guess what they started with? The British Bulldog versus Jake the Snake Roberts. Perhaps if the year were 1991, this would have been considered a relatively passable TV match. In 1996, it was most definitely not passable. I have been watching wrestling long enough to know that when Jim Cornette has to constantly interfere to cover up for what's happening in the ring, that is not a good sign. I don't think Jim was quite part of the booking team at this point. I think it was still too early for that. But you can't convince me for 1 second that he did not produce every bit of this match. This is a textbook example of him saying, I know how ungodly terrible this is going to be. I am well aware that Jake Roberts is nearly incapable of bumping, much less selling for long stretches of time. I am going to lay this out like an old school Memphis match, where I take on the role of Jimmy Hart and just interfere left and right to try to fuck over the babyface. And that is precisely what JC did. I mean, he's out there hitting Roberts with the tennis racket, swiping at his feet when the ref's not looking, just literally doing anything to divert the people's attention away from how truly awful the match is. And so finally, Jake hits the DDT at the end. He goes for the cover, but JC reaches in and pulls Jake off of Davey Boy. So Jake goes over to the bag and pulls out the giant python so he can chase Cornette up the aisleway with it. And of course, Jake loses by countout, which he then sold by waving his hands in the air and saying, oh well, hey everyone, check out how cool my snake is. So this sucked, as I expected. From there, we had another one of those insider baseball pre-tapes with Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart. Last week, they showed us a little bit of their training regimen. We saw Jose Lothario make his debut as they revealed that he was Shawn's trainer and coach when he first broke into the business back in '84. So, well, we start here with Shawn going over his backstory of getting ready to leave his home after he had trained with Lothario for a bit, but he was still unsure of what he was supposed to do in the ring. So he called up Jose on the phone and asked for some advice. And Jose told him to listen, shut up, and keep your ears and eyes open. Well, that about sums up every issue Shawn ever had in his life, right? Listen, watch, and shut up. 3 things that Shawn was not prone to do in the early stages of his career. And it's why he fell flat on his face when Vince finally put the strap on him. Meanwhile, we had the next chapter of condescending Bret Hart discourse. I'm partially kidding, but also not. He was really healing it up on Shawn here, talking about how seriously Bret takes his craft. He has one of those boomer lines at one point where he's talking about how wrestling ain't ballet, It's not a dance contest. And that's why Bret hates everything Shawn represents when it comes to how he carries himself in the ring. While he's out there grandstanding and hot dogging for the camera, Bret's taking his work seriously and showing why he's the best in the world at everything he does. Talked about his son having a lot of Shawn Michaels apparel, him being a huge Shawn fan, which, while he didn't outright admit here, he basically concluded that it irritates the fuck out of him. And again, dude, he's just going off on Shawn the whole time, calling him a cocky, irritating, obnoxious prick, and how any self-respecting kid would be smarter to look up to Bret as a role model than Shawn. I mean, it's hilarious because I am 100% in Bret's camp. Everything he's saying about Shawn here is absolute fact. But like, oh my God, how is this guy a fucking babyface? I keep saying it over and over and over and over again, and I will keep reiterating it because it is 100% true. The more I watched the build-up to this Ironman match, Bret Hart should have unquestionably turned heel before the match. It would have made this thing so much hotter. Just listening to him rip into Shawn in the most denigrating manner imaginable, it's fucking hilarious. But it also makes him look like the world's biggest dick in storyline. Such a missed opportunity, man. Them trying to do babyface versus babyface for this feud was so dumb. Nobody's buying it. Everybody can see right through Bret here. And speaking of seeing through things, I think that's what Goldust was doing during his confrontation with Roddy Piper on Raw last week. Looking right through that skirt to see the goodies that lie underneath. So we had a match with Fatu this week. It's too bad this all predated the Stinkface spot. Elsewise, I think Goldust would have been a fan of working with Fatu more often. This mostly sucked. Goldust wrestling in the kilt was oddly humorous, but they did a bunch of hokey comedy with Fatu spanking Goldust on the ass, him headbutting Goldust in the groin. Just lame. Piper was on the phone talking about how serious he was when it's coming to this backlot brawl. He more or less promised that somebody was getting carted off in an ambulance by the time it was over. I believe his closing statement was, if you have a weak heart, don't come. And that comment alone can be used for many different circumstances in life. So, oh, by the way, Goldust won with a terrible-looking reverse DDT, in case you were keeping track. I believe that was the first time Goldust actually won a match since becoming Intercontinental Champion, which is quite astonishing. And then we eventually get to the in-ring segment with Camp Cornette. The babyfaces laid out the challenge on WWF Superstars. They want the six-man with Yokozuna, Ahmed, and Jake Roberts versus Owen, Davey Boy, and Vader. And, well, Jim basically said, sure, we'll take the fair fight. Because that's exactly what heels are supposed to do. They gave Owen and Davey a chance to comment, which, in hindsight, probably was not the best idea. Owen was fine. He just cut the heat promo on the babyfaces and said they don't have the brains and the power like Vader, Davey, and Owen do to get the job done. Davey was, well, here's essentially what he said. He said, I am the strongest athlete in the World Wrestling Federation. not Ahmed Johnson. And at WrestleMania, we're going to find out who the strongest man really is. Didn't you literally just establish that you are the strongest man in the WWF? So why do you need the match to prove it? You said you're the strongest. You're the heel. You don't have to prove anything. So then Jim got back on the stick to try to save whatever he could. He called Yokozuna a stupid ingrate, said that he hired JC as his English spokesperson because every time he tried to open his mouth, he made a blithering fool out of himself. JC was responsible for taking Yokozuna to the top of the card. Not that senile old man, Mr. Fuji, who apparently, in storyline, is currently cooped up in a hospital bed recovering from knee surgery after allegedly falling down the stairs, even though Cornette was standing right behind him and couldn't do anything to save him when it happened. So, yeah, he more or less just conceded to attempted homicide. Hope he's got Clarence Mason on standby for the incoming lawsuits. And, well, there's one little issue here. The heels got cocky too soon. Turns out that Jim didn't read the fine print before signing the contract. The stipulation, as we found out courtesy of Yoko, Roberts, and Ahmed, is that if the babyfaces win, they would get 5 minutes alone in the ring to do whatever they wanted to Jim. And considering the three men Corny was up against here, that probably would have signaled the end of his career. Getting bonsai splashed by Yoko, on top of Jake possibly letting his python eat Cornette alive. God only knows what Ahmed would have done. He'd have probably tried to power slam Cornette and accidentally broken his back. Fucking klutz that pea-brain was. I'd have rather taken the bump from Yoko. So that at least gave this segment a little bit of sizzle. At least they're giving the people a hook for that six-man. Because, God, you look at that thing on paper. Ugh. Not what I would have booked. If memory serves me right, without looking it up, I don't think the babyfaces go over in that match. So for anybody wondering, what was the point of adding the stipulation? I have no fucking clue. You would have to ask Jim. And or Pat Patterson, who probably booked it. So then we had the best burial squash of all time. Whether or not they planned for it to happen. It's Diesel versus Barry Horowitz. And before I talk about what happened there was an angle they shot the previous week in MSG during one of their house shows. It was supposed to be a tag match with Taker and Brett teaming up to face Diesel and Shawn. And to be honest with you, I'm still not entirely sure the match ever happened, based on the footage they aired here. The only thing we saw was a brief fight between Taker and Diesel in the aisleway, and the next thing you see is Diesel laying everybody out in the ring with a chair, including Shawn. There's a brief clip where referees are helping Shawn to the back, and you hear Shawn say, "I'm going to kick his 7-foot ass," which I laughed at. But if you know your WWF timeline well, you know what this is all setting up. The angle was done to set up the eventual MSG cage match between Diesel and Shawn for the WWF title in May, which ended up being Diesel's last match for the WWF before he left for WCW. Of course, everybody knows that event more so for being the infamous curtain call, where all the Clique members broke kayfabe and did the group hug in the cage right before Hall and Nash left. Just blatantly exposing the business in front of everybody, despite the people literally just saw Diesel and Shawn trying to maim each other in a cage for the previous 15 minutes, or however long the match was. All of a sudden, they're hugging like brothers afterwards. I'd actually forgotten about them setting up the turn in MSG to then eventually blow it off back in MSG a few months later. So, even though I wound up hating everything that moment represented, the angle itself was cleverly done. Of course, it does bring up the obvious question. If Diesel was supposed to be Shawn's first major title feud coming out of WrestleMania, why the hell did Diesel job the Taker clean? It's honestly a good question. And I'm sure this is the point where Vince started realizing, hey, you know, we got a unique thing going here with Taker being undefeated at WrestleMania every year. Why don't we try to make this some kind of annual attraction? So maybe that was his mentality at the time. I don't know. But anyway, getting back to the squash match. You know what the sad thing is? I'm not even necessarily blaming Kevin Nash for what happened here, but considering his reputation around this period, it also wouldn't surprise me if he blatantly did this on purpose just to be a dick. So he's out there having his match with Horowitz. It's every generic 5 moves of doom Diesel match you've ever seen, counting the hair flip. And eventually Paul Bearer starts rolling a casket down to ringside. And it's supposed to be a distraction tactic so Diesel would take his focus away from the match. The problem is that as Paul Bearer is rolling this casket down to the ring, Diesel is simultaneously distracted while he's kicking Barry's ass. At one point, you see him give Barry a sidewalk slam while looking down the aisleway and clearly having his attention diverted. So even in the attempt at doing a distraction spot, Kevin Nash still believably kicks the guy's ass without even trying. Unreal. They give Barry like 30 seconds of offense when he hits Diesel from behind and throws a couple of punches, which Diesel barely sold. Then he just cold cocks him with a big boot and starts beating him up again. And the finish is remarkable. Diesel has Barry down on the mat, and he's throwing a couple punches at his head. He's still looking at the casket at ringside while he's pounding the shit out of Barry. And then Diesel just looks down, punches Barry in the head one final time, and he pins him. Just totally made the guy look like a geek. And I know that was sort of Barry Horowitz's gimmick, but God, that was insulting even for him. So anyway, Nash goes over and grabs a wrench afterwards, and he slowly starts making his way over to the casket, expecting Taker to pop out when he goes to open the lid. Still not entirely sure how the wrench was going to solve anything, but I mean, we're operating under heel logic here. And so he opens the lid. There's a very ominous gong noise. And it is revealed that Taker is not inside the casket. Rather, it is a presumed Diesel dummy hidden under saran wrap. And I'm sure you're all thinking, how in the fuck? Well, as stupid as it may seem, there is a logic to how this is done from a television perspective. For the people in the building, I think it's just assumed that they either couldn't see or the dummy they put inside the coffin for television resembled Diesel somewhat closely, but I mean, you couldn't really tell. WWE's done this kind of smoke and mirror stuff with Undertaker before. There was a clip years ago. I don't even remember when or where this was done, but it was when Taker was feuding with Randy Orton sometime in the mid to late 2000s. They did some kind of deal where I think Taker and Orton were having a match, and they had a casket propped up on some kind of metal grating. So when Taker went to open the casket lid, they cut to a pre-tape footage of the real Undertaker lying inside the casket, even though Taker was in the middle of working what was presumed to be a live match. So he was essentially looking at himself. And as somebody watching at home on television, if you're smart, you basically know that they post-produced all of it to fit it into the show. But then to avoid showing anything when they cut back to the live feed, Taker had already shut the casket lid so you never saw anything. Now, of course, for the people in the building watching, I don't remember how they tried to mask it initially. It was probably similar to what they did with Diesel here, where they had some kind of dummy in there momentarily, but they didn't have the lid open long enough for people to be able to tell that it clearly wasn't Taker. It's a very long-winded way of explaining it was a really stupid concept. Again, anybody claiming that I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Undertaker fanatic and I never criticize anything of his, well, here's me criticizing something Taker was involved with. It was stupid. And so is this post-match with Diesel. In any case, as we hear the wonderful birds chirping on the porch behind me, the main event, Bret Hart versus Tatanka. When I saw them throw the graphic up for this earlier in the show, I immediately groaned. I am at the point now where every time I see or even hear a mention of Tatanka's name, I just mentally check out. I can't even really call it go-away heat at this point. It's just, how the fuck do you still exist kind of heat? I have to remind myself that Tatanka was around for years in the WWF. When did he debut? Was it 92 or 93? It was a while ago. And as you recall, they had a hot streak going with him until they finally jobbed him out to Ludwig Borga, of all people. And after that, it was the nail in the coffin for his career. Nobody ever cared about him again. Then they tried to turn him heel. That god-awful feud with Lex Luger in 94 that nobody gave a fuck about. I know he's not around for a whole lot longer. I'm pretty sure 96 was the final year he wrestled for Vince before he started working indie dates again. I mean, the match they had was fine. There's nothing technically wrong with the work. It's the Tatanka burnout effect. Sick of seeing him. They do the spot where the kid comes out to try to restrain Bret on the apron, but he ducks as Tatanka nails the kid. And then Bret rolled him up for the 3. I'm telling you, man, they're definitely milking those Bret Hart performances while Vince still has him for a period of time. I think he's making up for lost cause now. All those weeks, the previous couple years where Bret was barely ever on the show, now he's all over the goddamn show. Oh, trust me, you'll be begging for Bret Hart to come back long before Steve Austin ever starts talking shit about him on television. You think it's bad now with lack of star power? Just wait until Bret's out of the picture for the next 9 months. But that was pretty much the show. There was another billionaire Ted skit they aired right before they went off air. And I said, fuck that noise. I mentioned the other week, I cannot stomach these skits anymore. I'm boycotting the rest of these things until they finally drop it after WrestleMania. We got 2 more weeks before the pay-per-view. I can make it. But again, man, it goes back to what I said at the top of the report. This whole card is almost solely carried by the Ironman match. Yeah, you got Diesel and Taker. Yeah, you got Piper and Goldust. Yeah, you got Warrior and Hunter. But if we're being honest, the main draw for WrestleMania 12 was always going to be about Shawn fulfilling the boyhood dream. And that way all the HBK marks could wet their panties over seeing him finally win the big one. Meanwhile, I was just pissed that they wasted an Undertaker match with Kevin fucking Nash. Anyhow. Are you all ready to wrap this one up? I sure am. Folks, thanks for stopping by. We'll be back on Friday for more of the classic coverage. It's going to be NWA, Mid-South, and World Class. And again, we have one more cycle of just Retro Raw next week, which will be the go-home show. And the following week, we'll have WrestleMania 12 and the Fallout edition of Retro Raw as well. So, just to give you a little bit of a timeline for what you're in for. And then, of course, we have like another 6 months or whatever it is until WrestleMania, or WrestleMania 41. Are they going to do this again next year? Are they going to hold out until May? God. I mean, they're just going to keep pushing Mania further every single year. By the year 2028, it'll be the week before SummerSlam. I don't know, dude. I got so many thoughts on WWE right now, and I just don't even know how to form it into a coherent sentence. I got all these ideas wrapped up in a ball, and I'm just kind of sporadically waiting to reveal all my thoughts. I mean, there's so much I could vent about when we talk about WrestleMania 41, but that's already going to be a slog of a pay-per-view to get through anyway. So, I don't know. I might just do another one of those segments where maybe I just kind of share some of my thoughts on modern pro wrestling in general, because it ain't getting any better. It's getting a whole lot worse. I think people are starting to come around to the reality of what's really going on. You know, people were so high on that John Cena heel turn at the Chamber a few weeks ago, and really didn't take long for people to flip the script. Now all of a sudden people are getting a little pissed off about the WrestleMania build. Newsflash, it's because the television product sucks. But I don't need to tell you that. Just watch it. Watch 15 minutes. You want to turn the show off immediately. I can barely handle sitting through clips. Anyway, we'll see you guys on Friday. Take care. Peace out.